You whisk soy sauce, garlic, oil, and lemon, drop a thick steak into the bath, and let it sit in the fridge overnight. The standard culinary protocol assumes that giving a marinade 12 or 24 hours will pull all those aromatics deep into the center of the tissue. But rigorous kitchen testing reveals a strict physical limit to that assumption. When testers submerged beef short ribs in a wine-based marinade and left them to soak for 18 straight hours, the expected deep penetration simply did not happen. This diagram shows a cross-section of that beef. After 18 hours, the wine traveled exactly 1 millimeter, roughly the thickness of a credit card edge. For a standard 1-inch steak, a 3 millimeter surface layer means the inner 3/4 remains totally untouched by the liquid. The immediate instinct is to leave the meat in the liquid even longer to force it further, but extending the soak time is manipulating the wrong variable entirely. The issue isn't a lack of patience. Deep seasoning is actively blocked by the physical and chemical structure of the meat itself. Relying on the clock to push flavor into the center of a muscle is physically flawed. To actually get seasoning past that outermost layer, you have to abandon time and instead manipulate ionic chemistry and physical geometry. Muscle tissue is remarkably resistant to outside liquids because of its baseline composition. A piece of raw meat is already roughly 70% water by weight. Looking at this model of cellular density, the tightly bundled muscle fibers have their microscopic gaps completely flooded. There is almost no void space left for a new liquid to occupy. It's like pouring water into an already saturated sponge. On top of that density problem, classic marinades rely heavily on oils to carry aromatics like garlic, herbs, and chili. Because oil and water actively repel each other, the lipid-based flavor compounds are chemically locked out. They cannot mix with the aqueous interior of the muscle, forcing those flavors to stay parked at the exterior boundary. For molecules to enter a solid without mechanical force, they must rely on diffusion, the slow wandering from an area of high concentration to low. And because marinating requires keeping meat in a cold refrigerator, the kinetic energy of those molecules drops, decelerating diffusion even further. You cannot safely bypass this cold temperature handicap. Leaving a raw piece of meat on the counter to warm up simply trades a flavor penetration problem for a bacterial food poisoning problem. Water saturation, hydrophobic oil repulsion, and low refrigerator temperatures form a combined physical barrier. Together, they ensure that complex flavor molecules remain strictly at the surface layer of the meat. There is exactly one common ingredient that breaks these penetration rules: salt. Unlike bulky aromatic oils, sodium chloride crystals dissociate into separate electrically charged sodium and chloride ions. Being tiny and charged, these ions move through tissue via diffusion and osmosis. The high exterior salt concentration draws fluids across cell membranes, pulling the ions inward toward equilibrium. Even with this ionic advantage, the process is incredibly slow. Salt is the fastest traveler in the marinade, but it still has to navigate a dense, fluid-filled structure. The general rule of thumb is that salt requires roughly 24 hours to travel just 1 inch deep into muscle tissue. When a cook successfully brines a large cut like a turkey overnight, they are not pushing herb and citrus flavors deep into the breast. They are providing the sodium ions the exact mathematical time required to crawl toward the center. Salt performs a secondary function. Sodium ions increase electrostatic repulsion between muscle filaments, forcing the protein structures to uncoil and widen. These newly widened gaps act as reservoirs. The muscle can now physically trap 10% more water weight, preventing drying out during cooking. Beyond salt, cooks frequently rely on 2 other common components to alter meat: acids and enzymes. Ingredients like vinegar or lemon juice lower the surface pH, which swells the proteins. Meanwhile, enzymes found in pineapple or papaya, like bromelain, act as molecular scissors that actively cut protein chains. But both compounds share a strict limitation. Extended exposure time does not push them deeper. Leaving acid or enzymes on meat for hours causes catastrophic structural failure at the outer boundary layer, turning the exterior into a soft paste. Enzymes carry a secondary weakness. They are highly fragile and destroyed by the application of heat. The moment the meat hits a hot pan, their tenderizing action stops immediately. Salt actively and safely rewires the interior of the muscle to retain moisture over hours of soaking. Acids and enzymes are strictly surface treatments that will punish a cook who leaves them on too long. This raises an obvious question. If marinades stop at the surface, why do dense liquids like soy sauce or a sugary teriyaki taste as if they have penetrated the entire cut? Looking at this sensory heat map, we see the answer is an extreme concentration of surface ingredients. Soy sauce loads the exterior with a flood of glutamates, while sugar caramelizes into a heavy crust upon hitting the heat. The flavor at the millimeter mark is so intense that it overloads your taste receptors. It creates a sensory illusion, tricking the brain into assuming that the heavily seasoned surface represents the entire bite. If a recipe requires liquid flavor inside a dense muscle, the science is clear. Passive soaking will never accomplish it. The commercial food sector solves this physics problem by forcefully bypassing diffusion. Industrial processors use multi-needle injection machines to push liquid flavor directly into the core. Processors also use massive vacuum tumblers. These machines mechanically massage the meat while pulling the ambient air out, forcing the muscle pores to open and achieving an artificial liquid uptake of 6 to 8%. That uniform deep flavor profile you taste in commercial or heavily glazed meats is never the result of passive marination. It is always achieved through intense sensory deception at the surface or aggressive mechanical force. Because the center of the meat is effectively a fortress, the cook has to stop optimizing for deep penetration. The strategy is to optimize for surface geometry. This model shows how slicing a large cut into smaller pieces drastically multiplies the available space. Instead of one large roast with a hidden, bland center, you generate a massive total surface area for the marinade to coat. If you need to keep the cut whole, you can score it. Slicing physical channels across the top effectively drags the exterior surface inward, giving the liquid a place to sit. You can also pound a cut like a chicken breast thin, taking a thick block of tissue and flattening it into a sheet that is almost entirely surface. Once you maximize that geometry, the chemistry dictates a clear rule for time. Because non-salt marinades only treat the surface, letting meat soak for 30 minutes is virtually as effective as leaving it in the fridge for 12 hours. The elements have distinctly defined roles. You cook for the surface crust, you rely on salt to create deep structural moisture, and you use a knife to manipulate the shape of the food. Abandoning the myth of the deep soak saves you hours of pointless waiting. By utilizing geometry and ionic chemistry, you can build intense flavor rapidly, permanently altering how you approach every piece of meat in the kitchen.